I said to him very emphatically and very definitely that an order be issued immediately under his signature to shoot to kill any arsonist or anyone with a Molotov cocktail in their hand in Chicago, to fire a building because they're potential murderers, and to issue a police order to shoot, to maim, or cripple anyone looting any stores in our city. And above all, the crime of arson is to me the most hideous and worst crime of any, and should be dealt with in this fashion. I was disappointed to know that every policeman out on the beat was supposed to use his own decision. In my opinion, he should have had instructions to shoot arsonists and to shoot looters.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host Seamus Melikafzeli and our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. I'm going to start today's episode with a simple question. Why do we care about what happens out in the world? Why do we care about the impacts of U.S. foreign policy? Traditionally, as people in the United States, we generally have the privilege of not caring. We've achieved manifest destiny. Most people here will never leave this country. And wars rarely, if ever, make it here. We bring the war to the world. This wasn't always the case, when the frontier was a lot closer. In the early years of the U.S., we were fighting the British, we were fighting the Indian Wars, fighting slave rebellions, and ultimately fighting ourselves. But since the end of the Civil War, the US has gone global and not looked back. One reason to care about what happens out in the world is moral. Killing people abroad is bad, and if we support that with votes, with money, with people, then we're doing bad acts, we're doing evil. This is spiritually compelling, but politically it runs into some problems. Harms to people far away, it may tug at our heartstrings, but people generally prioritize bread and butter issues at home. And in fact, it's hard enough to convince someone to take political action that improves their own lives. Especially if people are feeling exploited, it's hard to get them to care about other people far away that they may even have some racist or bigoted views about.
Another reason to care takes a different form. This is the idea of the imperial boomerang, the violence of colonialism rebounding back upon those that sent it out. César and Hannah Arendt were both writing in the immediate aftermath of World War II, trying to make sense of the fascist moment. César, for his part, writes in the Discourse on Colonialism, quote, "And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers stand around the racks, invent, refine, discuss. People are surprised, they become indignant. They say, 'How strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass.' And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack," unquote.
We've seen a resurgence of this kind of thinking in the Trump era. The all-out occupations of cities have brought back discussions of the imperial boomerang. We've also heard warnings by people who have watched the carnage in Gaza who say things like, if they can do this to them, then eventually they'll do it to you. This framing has purchase, but only limited purchase. And I think it really gets at some of the problems of all of the Trump fascism discourse. Because the reality is that they aren't actually coming for the majority of us. We know who they're coming for, and it's the people they've always been coming for. What's missed in much of the fascism panic is that fascism, it's not the antagonist or the end or the destruction of liberal democracy. At least in the settler colony, it exists alongside liberal democracy as its enforcer. That's a key difference between the European and the American experiences. The core of US settler identity, the American version of freedom, traces all the way back to President Andrew Jackson. And in Jacksonian democracy is premised on a double freedom. The freedom of the frontiersman from the authority of a centralized state on the one hand, and the freedom to expropriate and dispossess the indigenous of their land and the enslaved of their labor on the other. That requires brutal enforcement, which has found expression in different US institutions, both public and private, both domestic and international. The plantation, the reservation, the concentration camp, the prison, the occupation. It's no surprise then that the real utility of the boomerang concept has been in studying the so-called militarization of policing. I say so-called because one of the interventions of this scholarship is to show that policing always was militarized. In fact, the more you look at policing in the US, the clearer it becomes that the police and the military really grew up together, and that both institutions are engaged primarily in counterinsurgency against hostile populations, namely threats to capital and threats to empire.
We can also note today all the ways in which the military has become essentially copified, for lack of a better term. The advent of military quote-unquote police actions when there is no actual formal declaration of war against another country. Something clear and recent is the seizing of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro under the guise of a criminal domestic matter to be decided in a New York court. But this, of course, goes back to the War on Terror and even further back to Vietnam. Vietnam was one of the first real instances where the concept of counterinsurgency was openly flaunted against Americans who opposed the war, going beyond simply saying that someone like Senator Wayne Morse was helping out Hanoi by opposing the war.
I happen to hold to the point of view that it isn't going to be too long before the American people, as a people, will repudiate our war in Southeast Asia.
That, of course, is good news to Hanoi, Senator.
I know that that's the smear artist that you militarists give to those of us that have honest differences of opinion with you, but I don't intend to get down in the gutter with you and engage in that kind of debate, General. I'm simply saying that in my judgment, the President of the United States is already losing the people of this country by the millions.
Certain American congressmen called American protesters the quote-unquote Americang, who were engaged in infiltration and battle against the U.S. or engaged in a, quote, Americang invasion of Washington, D.C., unquote, as Senator J. Caleb Boggs remarked, the senator who, interestingly, was succeeded by none other than Joe Biden. Some protesters openly declared themselves Americang in response and flew the flag of the Viet Cong at protests. General Westmoreland, who led efforts in Vietnam and later failed miserably, said that protests effectively acted as a military aid to the Viet Cong and North Vietnam, saying that they represented a, quote, hope that he can win politically that which he cannot accomplish militarily, unquote. Nixon said almost the exact same thing on the campaign trail. In effect, Vietnam protesters were treated like a militaristic enemy, regardless of whether they were an organized force or not. During the '68 Democratic Convention, in addition to the police officers on the scene, over 1,000 intelligence agents were sent to Chicago to aid efforts against the protesters. What occurred at Kent State needs no further detailing.
I don't care whether you've never listened to anyone before in your lives. I am begging you right now, if you don't disperse right now, they're going to move in, and there can only be a slaughter. Would you please listen to me? Jesus Christ, I don't want to be a part of this!
Indeed, there's never been a clear separation between the military and the police, between imperialism abroad and colonialism at home. That continues today through the deployment of Border Patrol and ICE across the country, but also through the routinized, racialized violence that local police departments engage in on a regular basis. And to my mind, that's what makes the question of policing essential to a truly anti-imperialist politics. This, of course, brings us to questions around the mayoral campaign and victory of Zohran Mamdani, who was elected on a platform that mostly centered affordability, but also promised some sizable reforms to the NYPD. But early on, he's faced a decent amount of criticism for his approach. He's retained Jessica Tisch as police commissioner, the staunchly Zionist heiress to $1 billion fortune who was the top cop in the Adams administration. He's also faced criticism for his response to the NYPD shooting of Jabez Chakraborty. Jabez's family called for help because he was experiencing a health crisis. Police showed up and shot him in front of them, nearly killing him. He's now cuffed in a hospital bed and facing charges stemming from the incident. In his public comments on what happened, Mamdani called it a, quote, officer-involved shooting, language reminiscent of the Adams administration and pro-cop figures everywhere. And he thanked the first responders. More broadly, Mamdani seems to be taking a non-confrontational approach to the NYPD, which through its cop union is one of the most potent political forces in New York City municipal politics. Mamdani instead has been appealing to the concerns of rank-and-file officers and attempting to refocus their attention away from, quote, community safety, i.e., responding to people facing health crises in public, and toward the more traditional police work of, quote, crime fighting. That this framework is being embraced on the left as a victory, I think signals how far the retrenchment has come on the left since the high point of abolitionist thinking in 2020. It seems that many on the left have come to believe that actually breaking the political power of cops ought to remain a secondary political objective in comparison to class-based social democratic reforms, which to me undermines the role police power plays in creating and enforcing those class divides to begin with. And that's a problem that extends far beyond police responses to people in mental health crises. One thing that sticks out to me from our conversation with Orisanmi Burton from episode 3 is his reference to George Jackson, who wrote about abolishing the function of the prison as a concentration camp. And when I see all the different kinds of mass detention being unrolled in this moment, of migrants, of the incarcerated, of the homeless, I fear we are charging in the wrong direction. To discuss all of this, policing as counterinsurgency abroad and at home, the imperial boomerang, the limits of police reformism, and the organized power of cops, we've invited on Stuart Schrader, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. Schrader is the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, and the forthcoming book, Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Stuart Schrader, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism. Stuart, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Turbulence.
Thanks for having me.
In your book, Badges Without Borders, you write about how during the Cold War, the U.S. exported a securitization regime of urban pacification in order to repress national liberation movements in the global South. Can you unpack a bit what that looked like in practice and how it started to influence what was happening on U.S. streets?
Absolutely. So in Badges Without Borders, I mainly focus on a program that existed from the 50s into the 1970s, where the United States trained, assisted, and equipped police and paramilitaries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Approximately 50 countries received this assistance, and over 75 countries sent their police to the United States for training during this period. And the United States was primarily concerned with preventing communist revolution and other types of political rebellion in these regions of the globe, and used police as the means of preventing revolution because, on the one hand, police were cheaper than military support, although, of course, the United States was also giving a lot of support to militaries. And on the other hand, the notion behind it was that police were better able to prevent revolution. They were thought to be kind of closer to the people, closer to the ground. They were hailing from many of the same types of neighborhoods and social circles as the potential insurgents or revolutionaries. And they were therefore able to gather intelligence and otherwise kind of keep tabs on political currents that the United States was worried about. So the program, which was primarily called the Office of Public Safety, although it had some other names, drew from police experts across the United States. The people who worked in this program, some of them were just police who were a little bit bored with their lives. Maybe they wanted to escape their wife and kids or something and go overseas. But generally, they had a lengthy career, lots of experience in policing in the United States. Many of them were at the top echelon of the profession in terms of writing textbooks and training manuals and so forth. A number of them had military or other intelligence experience before becoming public safety advisors. And they oftentimes traveled around the globe to numerous different countries. Some, were kind of regional experts. If they had Spanish language skills, they would be sent across Latin America. And then many of them came back to the United States and continued their work in law enforcement, or particularly training, sometimes private investigation, and then other security consulting into the 1970s. And then even in the 80s, some of them were still quite active in the law enforcement sphere. And the one other important detail to note at this point is that when the United States declared a war on crime, Lyndon Johnson started talking about waging a war on crime around 1965. And that was when the first federal investment in the war on crime was passed by Congress. And it really, really grew in 1968 and then through the 1970s. And this was Washington providing money, technical assistance, equipment, and other types of aid to police around the United States. It was really replicating the model domestically that the United States was using overseas, which again was providing money, technical expertise, training, equipment, and so forth globally. And it was very consciously designed in this fashion. I mean, the legislative history is complicated, but at root, some of the people involved in coming up with this federal model for how to provide money from Washington to local police forces, they were very aware of the Office of Public Safety and how it operated. They were talking to some of these experts on policing and counterinsurgency overseas. And so the bureaucratic infrastructure was really replicated, as well as a lot of the technical expertise, the training and riot control, the recommendations for what types of weapons to use, how to gather intelligence, all of that was also replicated.
As you're describing in your work, you're connecting these developments in policing at home with the development of a strategy of counterinsurgency around the world, particularly after World War II. And that's really a continuation of, or an expansion of, America's project of imperial warfare. And, you're talking about the bureaucratic continuity, but it also seems like there is tactical continuity as well. We think about how policing has been modernized, for example, like mounted units, to the gridding of space, to performance of civility, to even particular snatch and grab tactics. It seems like domestic policing in the United States is really adopting the strategies of counterinsurgency as well. I'm wondering if you could speak more concretely about policing as counterinsurgency And maybe like on a theoretical level, whether you see that as an instance of imperial boomerang or imperial feedback, or how you would characterize that.
Sure. Well, as I said, the book mainly covers the post-World War II period. The term counterinsurgency comes into the security vernacular at the very end of the 1950s, most likely originated in the circle of security experts around Ed Lansdale, who is a somewhat famous and infamous CIA officer. And then the Kennedy administration really takes up the mantle of counterinsurgency as a set of combined practices, both productive and destructive at the same time. There's a kind of development-oriented aspect to it, as well as a security-oriented aspect to it. But of course, this isn't new. This has been going on in colonial and imperial warfare for a very long time. Certainly, some of the French experts going back to the late 19th century were very explicit about how, you could win many more colonial battles by building a hospital than you could by sending soldiers. There are quotes like that you find in the literature. So there's a long-standing awareness that political warfare has to kind of operate on multiple tracks, because the war is essentially about winning the kind of political loyalty of the masses, which is enormously challenging for a colonial power that is kind of being received in circumstances that the masses, they're generally not welcoming it. So the United States is doing this in the Philippines, across the Tropic of Cancer, as they say, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, in Central America, the Caribbean as well. The interesting thing about that kind of experience for mostly Army and Marines, the Marines in some ways have the longest experience doing this in these places, is that, as you suggest, many of these people come back to the United States and become police officers or even police chiefs. And weirdly, the U.S. Army becomes forgetful and has to relearn a lot of the counterinsurgency practices when they got to the 1960s and the experience of trying to prevent the revolution, for example, in South Vietnam. So in the meantime, a lot of this expertise, again, had really migrated to intelligence circles and to policing circles. And there was a sense that even military special forces were not exactly appropriate for the problem that the United States was confronting. A number of the intelligence officials coming out of the World War II experience believed that what needed to be done during the Cold War was to, roll back the tide of communism, meaning countries that have already experienced communist revolutions need to send special forces and local soldiers that the United States has trained to kind of overthrow the governments in those places. Obviously, this was not actually ever successful as tried by the United States, but it was also not the situation that needed to be done in a place like South Vietnam, where the government, the Republic of Vietnam, was an ally of the United States, and there was, an insurgency, but special forces and training locals in how to wage guerrilla warfare was not going to be successful. So policing was the most obvious solution here as a way to contain the insurgency, either arrest or kill the people who are waging guerrilla warfare, and also to strike fear in people who might be inclined to support the insurgents, to make it seem like there were going to be grave consequences for that support.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the forgetfulness of the U.S. military and also the origins of the kind of rhetoric of counterinsurgency in the 60s, when it seems like you can trace back counterinsurgency much further in U.S. history and argue that the U.S. has been fighting the quote unquote small wars of counterinsurgency since its origin, and trace back the counterinsurgency story all the way to the Indian Wars. And it seems like that is the first instance in which the U.S. is pioneering these strategies in which, yes, maybe on some level, the political objective is to win over the population, but from a military point of view and from a state coercion point of view, it's to treat the entire population as a potential enemy and treat a population as the cradle for a potential insurgency. I always find it notable and interesting when these lineages kind of get lost in the official narrative, but are continually recycled. And, you can kind of hear that even too in the rhetoric of military talking about Vietnam as Indian country or the Philippines as Indian country. And it strikes me that this is where the kind of settler colonial legacy of the United States comes into the policing story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is odd that a lot of the terminology that the U.S. military uses draws on this kind of vocabulary from the Indian Wars, even as there's a simultaneous kind of disavowal of their sort of relevance to the tactical repertoires. I do think that the controlling of space in hostile territory, again, did lend some not very useful lessons to the degree that people were studying them in the setting of, say, Vietnam or places in Latin America, where what the United States was trying to do was prevent a communist revolution. Again, it was largely the places that I look at that were receiving police training. These were places that were maybe democratic or quasi-democratic countries that were allied with the United States, where there was a fear of an insurgency that would break out into a full-fledged revolution. So the idea of being kind of like behind enemy lines or in hostile territory, the way that the kind of fantasy argument developed about what fighting Indians was like in the 19th century, it just really was not all that appropriate. Even as I think we could say there was a distinctive policing logic to some aspects of the Indian Wars once territory was secured. It was really about securing perimeters, maintaining the flow of commerce and, dividing the population into rigid binaries of good and bad.
If we're talking about Vietnam, I did want to bring things to a very specific decade. Like in the popular American imagination, the violent response to protests against the war in the late 60s is held up as the moment, or I guess set of moments, when the perception broadly of policing in the US really changed. Protesters were not just being treated as enemies of the peace, but sometimes literally enemies of the state, as insurgents that needed to be countered in the same way that the Viet Cong were being countered. So was this an actual turning point in policing, or was this just a small elevation in what was already happening around the country in places like Watts, or a simple importation of what American police are doing elsewhere in the world, like the policing that you're describing with the Office of Public Safety and its personnel?
Well, there's this famous image of this helicopter flying low over Sproul Plaza at Berkeley with a cloud of CS coming out of it, aka tear gas. The idea of using helicopters to distribute tear gas is drawn directly from the US experience in South Vietnam. And I write about this at some length in Badges Without Borders, that the history first of the adoption of CS as what was called a sort of super tear gas or super riot control agent. Its effects were quicker and more intense than the most widely used tear gas at the time. And the delivery methods, which were helicopter-based, or also they could be mounted on vehicles or even carried by individuals. And there's also footage in Berkeley of soldiers carrying these. They're basically like leaf blowers almost, but they have a tank of CS attached to them. And they blow this chemical at people. It doesn't work as well in wide open spaces like a plaza as the place where it was originally designed for, which was tunnels in Vietnam. The idea was if you filled a tunnel with CS, people inside it wouldn't be able to breathe. They would feel like they were, at grave risk of dying. So they would flee out of the tunnel. And then once they fled, they could be shot because they would reveal where they were hiding. They could be shot or maybe captured. So this technology, which was tested over several years and developed, and lots of companies got in on the action of developing different delivery systems and so forth. This came to be used directly in controlling and suppressing anti-war protest in the United States, as you say, toward the end of the 1960s. And I think one other kind of key piece that I would mention, and it really in some ways it's been on my mind recently because it brings us up to the present. But one thing that the Office of Public Safety did was try to instill the understanding among police around the globe that if a protest breaks out, try not to shoot people immediately with guns. Because if you shoot people with guns while they're protesting, they're likely to get really, really mad and respond with potentially even more intense violence, whether against property or people. And the government will lose some legitimacy, and it'll become very hard to make the argument that the government should remain in power. And it will, basically give fodder to the critique of the government. They always said, don't create a martyr because the communist movement loves a martyr. That was kind of their argument. And they were, successful in some ways and unsuccessful in other ways across the globe in imparting this lesson. But it really did take hold in the United States when you compare, for example, the rebellions in Detroit and Newark in 1967 versus the rebellions in DC, Baltimore, and Chicago, a few other places in 1968 after King was assassinated. The amount of bullets fired by soldiers, is dramatically different. I don't remember the exact numbers. They're in the book, but goes from like thousands fired in 67 to, a handful fired in 68. And in 67, almost no CS is used in suppressing the rebellions. And then in 68, a huge amount of CS is used, particularly in Washington, D.C. So this argument about a kind of shift in how to manage or control or suppress protests and rioting, again, it comes out of expert recommendations from the Office of Public Safety and people in those circles, and it has pretty quick effect. And I would say it's basically been the case that, since 1968 in the United States, at least, it's been quite rare for protests or quote unquote riots to be met with soldiers firing rifles blindly into crowds. And part of the shock of the shooting of Alex Preddy and Renee Good has been exactly the fact that people in the United States, they may expect to get clubbed or gassed or, experience other forms of violence. I'm not saying that there isn't violence in protest control. Obviously there is. But people just don't expect to see people getting shot down in cold blood in these kind of protests.
I wanted to ask more about ICE, but before then, I did want to ask if during the most recent protest waves with Palestine, with perhaps protests against the Iraq War or other wars involved in a larger war on terror, were there examples of counterinsurgency post 9/11 that you saw come back home in ways that were distinct from how things came back home during Vietnam?
One of the things I always say about the present is that the public safety advisors that I look at in the book, if they had access to the types of surveillance technologies that even small town police now have access to, it would really just blow their minds. I think that there is a qualitative transformation that has occurred in the ability of law enforcement to monitor people, both people who are engaged in political activities and people who aren't. And I think that, to some degree, don't even know the full extent of it. I think there's been a little bit of a sort of sustaining fantasy that even people who probably should know better hold on to, which is like, if you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. But it's become clear, particularly over recent months with the operations of the Department of Homeland Security, that they are collecting vast amounts of data that the Fourth Amendment should say that they can't, just collect in these kind of blunt dragnet forms. There was a pretty good article in the Washington Post, I think it was like a week before everybody got laid off, but it said, these are all the technologies that DHS is using, including cell tower simulation, drones, et cetera, et cetera. It just kind of went down the list. And I do think that after 9/11, there was obviously, well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously. I'm teaching a war on terror class right now to mostly college students who were born after September 11th. And so I often say, obviously, and then I remember, well, it's not obvious. After September 11th, the United States made this decision to expand its surveillance net in just kind of unimaginable ways. And in particular, there was a lot of emphasis on what was happening in New York City with the collaborations between NYPD and CIA and other agencies to monitor Muslims, almost all of whom were engaged in nothing remotely illegal or tantamount to terrorist activity. They were just going about their everyday lives. And a decent amount of that surveillance was premised on a kind of identification of who might be likely to engage in certain types of activities. And this is consistent with what ends up becoming the architecture of the global drone assassination program, really, which is, again, to just use a signature or metadata to identify people who seem to be likely to be engaged in terrorist activities or whatever. And I think that weirdly, people have been maybe not suspicious enough of how easy it can be to fit those criteria. And then now with the Department of Homeland Security, clearly being totally willing to violate any sorts of constitutional protections, everybody's metadata has basically become fair game. If you're anywhere near the activities of DHS, which they're now operating all over cities and even small towns. And so many of these situations, the shooting in Chicago of Miramar, she was basically just driving by and saw ICE and started honking her horn and shouting to warn people. And within seconds, she's shot by an ICE officer. The collection of data in those types of situations, if ICE are carrying a cell tower simulator, they can collect data of anybody nearby without them knowing and without them necessarily even being remotely involved in kind of protest or ICE Watch or anything else.
I think you're identifying a pretty interesting contradiction, if I can call it that, where you're talking about why counterinsurgency as a paradigm is adopted, right? You can actually achieve more in the sense of control in your political objectives or your social or governance objectives by not going out and shooting people, by employing surveillance infrastructure and by influence campaigns, what have you. So there's the kind of rise of counterinsurgency as a paradigm and the development of technology in order to aid that. And we've seen that with policing and, of course, with DHS. But also, on the other hand, you have these really dramatic acts of brute force and violence and like fascistic violence that do end up catalyzing opposition and anger. And, of course, we know like the recent headline cases that you mentioned, but also this has catalyzed huge amounts of opposition when the police are going out and just, shooting unarmed Black people. And I wonder how you make sense of that within the function of policing. Like, can policing actually escape that dichotomy or that contradiction between the kind of governing logic of counterinsurgency, but also the like irresistible impulse towards brute force and fascistic violence?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's useful to keep in mind that counterinsurgency, again, in its kind of classic high period of the 50s to the 70s, at least in the United States, is really, it's a liberal paradigm that is consistent with the kind of developmentalism that the United States was involved in, which was always, limited and partial at best, but was oriented toward fostering the growth of global capitalism and instituting regimes that would be amenable to the United States. The policing component, as you suggest, many of the policing experts that I look at were what we might consider on the more, quote unquote, progressive side of policing. That's still like very, very conservative. But they're, for the most part, quite aware that even within this sort of developmental paradigm, where I have a critique of the hearts and minds discourse in some of my writing, but I'll just use it for now for shorthand. The idea of winning hearts and minds through developmental means, these policing experts were always quite clear that there were some people who were never going to accept that. Their hearts and minds could never be won over. And so they would have to be quarantined one way or another, again, arrested, killed, or, otherwise eliminated. And I think that some of the, again, liberals in the policy sphere and certainly in the development agencies, they were oftentimes naive about this. They thought that this was just something kind of at the margins. But of course, the logic of counterinsurgency suggests that there's always a risk of greater and greater numbers of regular people becoming enthralled with the insurgency or the revolutionary politics. And so the pool of people who might be subject to harsh security measures is always potentially growing. And it just becomes somewhat self-perpetuating. You go after somebody's father because he might be seen to be helping the insurgents in some way, providing food or shelter or whatever. And next thing you know, all of the sons and daughters in the family have declared themselves against the regime. It's a very easy to understand story, but it's a very hard challenge for these officials who are trying to, again, quote unquote, win hearts and minds, because they have to create these rigid dividing lines in a very complex and fluid and somewhat chaotic political situation.
I wanted to go back specifically to ICE, because when you mentioned you're teaching this course to people who were born after 9/11, about 9/11, I should confess something to people who are listening to this and also to you. I was born before 9/11, but I have no memory of 9/11 or any part of American life before that point. So the ubiquity of the Department of Homeland Security, just all of the TSA and the security theater that came after that is always something that I had experienced. But the ways in which it has manifested under the Trump administration, I think I had an idea that police are not supposed to work in the shadows, but they're not supposed to assert themselves in the way that an occupying army would. So can you talk about how, you mentioned a little bit how 9/11 and the War on Terror changed surveillance and police tactics, but how did it change its public image? Why did it become so important for law enforcement in America, not just local cops, but ICE and other DHS agents, to devote so much of their resources to security theater, to asserting themselves in public, of making their presence known?
Yeah, I mean, living in New York City in the years after September 11th, all of a sudden, in places like Penn Station, you started to see these soldiers in fatigues carrying assault rifles. And I think a lot of New Yorkers, myself included, were like, what the hell is going on? Like, this is not actually making us feel more safe. And I hope that people still feel that way. And maybe a perverse effect of the ICE takeovers is that it's going to kind of reinforce people's suspicions and concerns about there being heavily armed people in fatigues in public locations like this. But it really was somewhat astonishing and unnerving how rapidly this became part of everyday life. Obviously, the campaigns, that if you see something, say something, that campaign in the New York City subway, eventually became national, even global. And, now it's just kind of like the backdrop of our lives. To bring it more specifically to policing, one interesting thing that has happened over the past couple decades in policing is that from the 1990s through the period of September 11th and into, say, like early 2010s, you had the broken windows paradigm of policing, the emphasis on control of quote unquote quality of life offenses, and then the rise of the kind of industrialized stop and frisk regime, again, in New York City, certainly while Bloomberg was the mayor. And what these did was create this very thick, heavy presence of police. Quality of life policing tended to be occurring in the kind of downtown business district, tourist areas, and it was about cleansing the socially marginal from those areas. And stop and frisk, for the most part, was targeted in the poorest neighborhoods, public housing, and so forth. And, when you put these two together, you had this likelihood, and this spread across the country to many cities, Baltimore, you had some people who were just having consistent, regular interactions with police over and over and over again. And certainly in Baltimore, one of the ideas behind this kind of saturation presence of policing was to scare people from leaving their houses if they didn't have to. You can't get shot in the street, you can't get murdered in the street if you're not outside your house. It's a crude and crass way to put it, but that was essentially the thinking about kind of instilling fear of police encounters. After 2014, 2015, when the Black Lives Matter protests take off, and then certainly, especially after 2020 and the next round of massive protests and amid the pandemic, police really change their orientation. They pivot away from this kind of thick saturation type of presence, and they sort of recede more into the shadows. the anti-crime policing goes from a kind of general blunt force dragnet targeting to highly specific raids, arrests, and so forth. A lot of it, again, based on, intelligence gathered through means that are not totally transparent outside of police departments, but likely violating the Fourth Amendment. And so you have these task forces. The gun trace task force in Baltimore is the kind of most famous example, that are just like wildly criminal. They're engaged in the most outrageous types of violence, theft, and other types of certainly constitutional civil rights violations. And that's where the paradigm of crime control pivots. Again, it's away from a sort of saturation model to a more targeted model. To bring this up to the present and back to ICE, what we're seeing with ICE is a weird kind of combination of the two, particularly in Minneapolis, where they're using, on the one hand, intelligence and other types of technological means to go after particular individuals at the same time as they're asserting their ability to saturate the city. In Minneapolis, which is a relatively small city, at the peak, they had something like 3,000 officers in place, which is, something like 6 times the number of police officers that the Minneapolis Police Department has. So I think what remains to be seen going forward is what will the policing paradigm look like post ICE operations. As of this morning, there's supposedly a drawdown of ICE operations in Minneapolis. I mean, I'm not going to get too excited about that definitely happening because DHS is not very truthful in their public announcements. But nevertheless, I do think, it's not likely to continue at the rate it's going. ICE is going to move to other cities, move to different types of tactical approaches. But the real question is, what are police going to be doing going forward? How are police going to react? And there's already been this really massive PR campaign by police in Minneapolis and other places, certainly these reformist police chiefs like O'Hara, the chief in Minneapolis, who was brought in to kind of rehabilitate the image of the Minneapolis police force after the murder of George Floyd. He'll talk to anybody, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, you name it, and talk to them about how he's really worried about the harm that ICE is posing to the image of the Minneapolis police force. So I think that there's going to be, again, I don't have an exact prediction of tactically what things are going to look like on the other side of this for municipal police forces, but I do think there's going to be a really strong effort to say, we are not ICE. We operate differently. We don't violate the Constitution. Now, of course, I would warn people not to believe those types of claims, but nevertheless, it's going to be, I think, a really powerful discourse that we're going to be encountering for a while.
It sounds to me like what you are describing, big picture, is that there is this concept of public order that is a very large container and doing a lot of work. And it seems to contain some countervailing forces. One is about policing insurgency, is about targeting and eliminating national threats or threats to the state as such. And then the other is a kind of like more mundane, routinized protection of capitalism. And I think that the kind of like counterinsurgency versus brute force overreaction can map onto that in interesting ways. And the combination of them produces interesting results that shift with the political winds. And we can see that within policing as an institution, within ICE, within the military, within the decision to lean on any one of those institutions, given a particular political arrangement. As we've traced out the history, it seems like the focus during the Cold War was about the risk of revolution. It was about the risk of some of these left-wing ideas catching hold. And then when the Cold War ended and the shift came to the war on terror, it really became about the fear of threats from without, an attack on the country, what have you. And the different arrangements of power and structure reflected those different orientations. And I think maybe what we're seeing now, or what's potentially novel about this moment, is a bit of a collapse between the domestic and the international. In the Trumpian articulation, the threat is from without, but it's already here. It's the immigrants that have come in that have diluted whatever the white population and are in and around and among us. And so the different forms of control seem to have kind of collapsed in on each other. We have police and ICE stepping on each other's toes and a kind of confusion and a kind of reliance on these dramatic utilizations of force at the expense of something that maybe would feel more sustainable for the perspective of capitalism or anything like familiar as public order. And I'm just wondering, when you see all of this play out, when you see that kind of collapse of the domestic and the international. Does that feel like a categorical shift? Does it feel like a Cold War or post-Cold War logic kind of dressed up in a new way? Or does it feel like some of these institutions are fundamentally breaking on some level?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. Certainly, again, in the first book, Badges Without Borders, I do try to demonstrate how this global dispersion of police expertise really did obliterate some of the meaningful character of the foreign domestic divide. It became this kind of single, not even, but somewhat seamless territory for the institutionalization of new types of security expertise and security practices. The figures that I look at, I think, really didn't draw too sharp a distinction between domestic space and foreign space. And they really saw their primary opponent or the primary threat as those actors who themselves traveled across these spaces. Certainly, as the 60s wore on, with the connections of particularly Black radicals to places like Cuba, Algeria, other places in Africa, and then ultimately in Asia, for many of these security experts, this was kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was like this was what they were most afraid of, and now it was actually happening, that the radicals were somewhat borderless. And so their security practices became borderless in anticipation of that already.
If we're talking about the fears amongst law enforcement that these radicals, as you say, were borderless, I'm curious what kind of precedent you see for this open hostility to American cities. I mean, not just in conduct, but in rhetoric, and not just in tactics, but like the very basis of their counterinsurgency. I mean, I'm remembering the president posted online, I think last year, comparing Chicago to the battlefield in Vietnam, which raised alarm with a lot of people then. And now other admin officials regularly talk about these cities as if they were war zones to be pacified and conquered. ICE personnel were talking about being, quote unquote, in country while they were in Minneapolis, which is how U.S. soldiers would talk about Vietnam when they went over there. It was brought up in this conversation earlier how soldiers would call other countries Indian country, bring their own domestic civil conflicts out into the wider world. But was this the way that American police departments and federal law enforcement spoke about cities in the past? For example, predominantly Black locales? Or has this kind of open, unabashed wartime rhetoric never been seen before against its own people?
On the one hand, I think there is a long tradition in the United States of a kind of anti-urban bias that goes back to certainly the 19th century, if not before. On the other hand, since the 1960s, the moment of civil rights and Black power movements and the increasing political power of Black populations in cities where there started to be Black mayors and a Black political class, along with the rebellions of the most marginalized people in some cases, and also some in other cases, middle-class people in cities. Cities came to be seen as a particular type of security challenge. When I was doing the research for Badges Without Borders, I noticed that so frequently the security experts would invoke Saigon and Harlem or another American city in the same breath. They drew a sort of seamless continuum between these places, and it was exactly because of Black political rebellion, Black political organizing, and the fear of white ruling class loss of control and power. So the idea of the urban as a kind of degraded space, a threatening space, an insecure space is really driving a lot of the kind of tactical thinking and innovation in this moment. The threat of urban guerrilla warfare is on the minds of a lot of security experts. They're trying to figure out, because, of course, at the time, it didn't make sense. It would have been redundant in the 1960s to say rural guerrilla warfare. It was inherent that, guerrillas came from the peasantry. Certainly, the Chinese Revolution provided that model. But then it starts happening in urban spaces. Well, what exactly are we talking about when we say urban guerrilla warfare? There were so many conferences and social scientific inquiries into what this meant. But really, ultimately, what it meant was political activity that might be treading on the bounds of lawfulness by Black people, by Puerto Ricans, et cetera. So to hear this kind of rhetoric today coming out of the Trump administration, I mean, in some ways, it's particularly farcical because Trump is such an urban creature. I mean, he is a product of Queens more than anything else. But there is a way that the notion of the kind of tactical challenge that cities pose has a certain resonance among people who are thinking about security. Whether it's, from the movies, Black Hawk Down, which is a kind of classic example of the total failure of the U.S. military in a kind of urban battle space that made it to Hollywood, or just in the more generic urban jungle metaphor, I think it has this kind of long-standing resonance. At the same time, what's particularly perplexing, maybe in some ways, is that, the cities of the United States are really the only economic drivers of this country. And certainly the big cities that are governed by Democrats, where, Trump wants to target Democratic elected officials from the level of the city council on up to, members of Congress. There's only so much to actually be gained by the Trump administration from actually harming these cities. For example, in New York City right now, the tunnel project for the trains beneath the Hudson River between New York and New Jersey is on hold because of the Trump administration targeting Democratic elected officials. But it's genuinely harmful to the regional economy for the train tunnels to be so inadequate, let alone how harmful it is to people's everyday lives because they waste so much time waiting for delayed trains. So all that's just to say that I don't think that using these kind of tropes of, warfare and so forth and the degraded character of cities, I don't think it really comports with a 100% pro-business agenda that Trump purports to have. So I think it does suggest that we need some other ways to think about this.
We're talking about the costs of over-militarization of policing and police response from the perspective of capital accumulation and the institutional interests of policing itself or of the state. And I think the flip side of that is actually what is to be gained through reform. And I want to return to something that you had mentioned earlier, which was all of the ways that police responded to the moments of 2014 and 2020, and to try and bring that up to the present. Because a main through line in the story of modern policing, both domestically and via counterinsurgency abroad, is reformism, quote unquote modernization, professionalization, and capacity building of police were all framed as progressive reforms during the 20th century, but ultimately strengthened the coercive capacity of the state rather than reducing it in any real sense. And in fact, this actually may be a key mechanism of that expansion of power. Kind of as we are discussing, policing power doesn't actually just grow through brute force. If anything, it's the reforms itself that can consolidate that. And as we've seen, there have been these moments of crisis for the legitimacy of policing, and the recent ones being the 2014 moment and the 2020 moment. But also what we've seen is that they have produced, at the street level, they've produced these demands for reforms, but then those demands get metabolized by politicians and the state. And the result is that police authority is reorganized and it's rearticulated. And so what appears as progressive change ultimately ends up being this re-legitimization of policing that allows it to survive these crises and emerge stronger with greater capacity for violence. And, this brings us, I think, kind of invariably, and, disclosure, we're all New Yorkers here in some capacity, to the current moment with Mayor Zohran Mamdani. And, we're a couple of months now, I guess 6 weeks now into Mamdani's administration. And he's already taken some heat around individual actions on policing. But kind of more broadly, what we're seeing from a policy perspective is a pretty reformist approach. We're hearing about expanding non-police crisis response through other city agencies, routing mental health and homelessness calls away from the NYPD building out quote unquote community safety infrastructure while explicitly maintaining the size and centrality of the function of policing. And so I think the risk here is that you don't actually see necessarily a reduction in state coercion so much as that reorganization that we're talking about. And that if he's successful in implementing this, which is, I guess, a big if for reasons we'll probably talk about after this, I think the risk is that some of New York's most at-risk populations, the visibly poor, mentally ill, and unhoused, might be increasingly governed through these administrative pathways of surveillance and containment under the banner of care, under the banner of reforms. So I guess what I want to ask you about is how you countenance this risk. How do you make sense of the challenge of Zohran's approach to policing? And do you see it as a risk that it actually provides an opportunity for the further consolidation of police power?
Well, I have to say that, everything you said about, reform, basically continually perfecting the, machinery of repression, has been at the core of my kind of analytic agenda for quite some time about policing. So I've been making this type of critique for a long time. And it leads to a great amount of pessimism about the possibilities for any type of, significant transformation of policing. The notion that policing is able to constantly kind of like reincorporate some of the critiques leveled against it by maintaining the sort of status quo and reestablishing its legitimacy through modest reforms, the addition of body-worn cameras, the adoption of new training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, that leads to a lot of pessimism that I have explained at length in my writing. On the other hand, to try to keep myself sane, I do want to have a little bit of optimism about the Mamdani administration, because I think without that optimism, life gets somewhat hard to live, to get out of bed every day. But you're right that without the creation of a new kind of institutional basis, it's very likely for the NYPD, which is an extremely powerful and very large organization, to be able to continue to be in the driver's seat of anything related to public safety. I think the idea of creating a new department under the mayor's control that would be staffed with a totally different type of expertise and a different type of, street response capacity is really not something that has been tried in the United States. There have been a number of models, the Cahoots model, for example, in the Pacific Northwest, where people who are trained in expertise at responding to mental health crisis and substance abuse challenges and so forth, they accompany the traditional EMS and police response. They don't replace it. I think that the call that the Mamdani administration has tried to answer, and it remains to be seen, is for this to be instead of, not in addition to. And, I think we need to be realistic about how the NYPD might respond. On the one hand, the NYPD is very unlikely to cede ground, is not thrilled about ceding any type of power. On the other hand, among regular officers, most officers would be thrilled to not have to actually be the people responding to these types of situations where they're not necessarily well-trained or very experienced. So institutionally, unwillingness to cede ground is perhaps somewhat different from what I think has actually fueled some of Mamdani's argument, which is to say, I've talked to police officers and they don't like dealing with mental health crises. They don't like dealing with homelessness, et cetera. So maybe there's some room for that potential friction between what officers themselves feel and what the institution is likely to do. But at the same time, we have to recognize that officers are themselves organized into a powerful, very conservative political bloc through their unions, obviously in New York City through the PBA, but in unions across the country. And that's what my new book is about.
Well, first note is I want to say, you talked about wanting to avoid a certain amount of pessimism for your own sanity. And just as a Palestinian and someone who's also politically Palestinian, I have fully divorced myself from that possibility. And so I know I often have access to levels of haterdom that other people are not accustomed to. But I think your answer kind of gets at the problem that I'm identifying with the reformist strategy, right? Because I kind of, I agree with you. I think that police often don't want to be playing these roles. And that's why Mamdani's been able to find common ground with police, even in their organized formations. But I think the question is, does that do anything to actually challenge police power, right? Is finding the common ground really going to address some of these larger structural problems around policing, or does it play into that reform cycle of actually building out their legitimacy, taking away a line of criticism while shoring up their ability to play their larger role, which is still going to be maintaining public order in this broad paradigm where that involves policing unrest and any form of threatening dissent and of protecting capital. Again, your forthcoming book about this blue power is about how police have formed these organizations and built up such tremendous political power and influence. And I wonder if you see the limitations of trying to meaningfully do something on policing without really confronting that in an antagonistic way.
Yeah, I guess I would say three things. The first is that in New York City, the really vertiginous wealth inequality is the fundamental problem here. On some level, I think that challenging that, it has to come first before, in some ways, or not, maybe I don't mean first in the sense of like separate chronologically, but as a primary challenge, that the left has for itself is dealing with the unaffordability crisis that is, driving so many of these problems that, register as, deviant behaviors that the police need to deal with. The second thing I would say is that the NYPD is such a massive organization as I suggested, and crime itself is so low in this city. I mean, of course, the NYPD will point to turnstile jumping or whatever, but in reality, the city is it is a very big city, but it is extremely, extremely safe on the whole in by any traditional measure of crime incidents. And so I think that does, create a real opening to say, what the hell do we need such a giant police force for that takes up so many resources? And the third thing I would say is getting to exactly your question, which is about the political power of police. I do think, as you suggest, yes, challenging the political power of police is imperative. How exactly to do that is not totally clear. I think that in the case of Zohran, he wasn't even going up against the PBA. The way that de Blasio's mayoralty was marked by extremely contentious relationships with both the Police Benevolent Association and the Sergeants Benevolent Association. I think the Mamdani approach, probably in some respects because they were listening to de Blasio's people, was like, tread very carefully, don't try to pick any fights with the PBA because it could derail everything. Whether getting rid of Jessica Tisch, as I think a lot of people on the left hoped he would do, would have antagonized the unions or allayed some of their concerns, I think it's not totally clear, but it's not, Tisch is not a popular person with the PBA per se, because she doesn't come out of the police department. So there's a lot of different dynamics, at play here that I think my read of it, at least, was that Mamdani or the people around him said, let's just not open this massive can of worms right now before we even get into office. Keep Tisch around for the time being so that she is on the inside. If something terrible happens, we can let her go and blame her potentially for whatever terrible thing might happen, to be seen, to be determined. And also we, as long as we keep her on, she isn't running against Zohran, in the for the next mayoral election. I mean, she may do that if she gets let go, but as long as she's still police commissioner, she can't be running against him. So, that's my read, and certainly, some of the other folks I've been talking to who study policing and study the NYPD, I think have, perhaps somewhat similar reads. None of this really gets to the fundamental question that we put on the table a minute ago, which is like, well, how the hell do you create a Department of Community and Public Safety to, at the everyday operational level, reduce the amount of contact between the NYPD and the most vulnerable New Yorkers?
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect place to close out. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.